So I agree with a lot of people on this. I'm really torn about my position on WikiLeaks. On one hand, exposing corruption is always a good thing. Transparency is good. However, putting people in danger is not. Um, I'm also really torn. Like, what makes Julian Assange or whoever the arbiter of what is corrupt? Who gives them the right to define what is corruption, what is good, what is bad? Who tasks them with making these judgment calls on a case by case basis as to, what is just and what isn't? Um, I know in some cases making that call is incredibly easy. It's easy to look at something and say this is good and this is bad, um, but oftentimes I feel like stuff falls into a gray area, and I really want to know what makes the WikiLeaks agenda the agenda of the world. And I'm really curious, have they ever not released something because it didn't correspond or advance their agenda or perspective? And I think that's a really interesting question that I don't actually know the answer to. The one thing that I think that really struck me more than anything was the exchange between Lamo and Manning regarding Manning's endgame after he released the information. Um, Manning said he released all this stuff in order to spur on reform and discussion, and um, worried that he was being naive in these hopes. I would really have to agree that he was being naive, and it really puzzles me because I'd say that if you want public discourse, leaking this information in that manner is not the way to have that happen unless you want the discourse to be about WikiLeaks. Um, if he'd been more strategic about his leaking and who he was leaking to and framed the story that he wanted to tell, he could have achieved some reform or some discourse, but by essentially unleashing a tsunami that contained, life-threatening information, he obscured his own point. Essentially, Manning was telling the world that war is bad and people at war can act inhumanely. That's not new, and that's not news. These are things that we know. Um, the details, it basically these are details outlining what we know about conflict and what we know about people at conflict, and how awful we can be. Um, so I would really honestly I'd like to know what he was hoping to achieve, because his actions don't his actions don't match what he said his achievements were. So I wonder what the underlying thoughts were behind releasing all of this.